Listen. In the quiet moments between breaths, you can almost hear it, a distant rumble that vibrates in your very soul. When the sky turns a bruised purple and the air grows heavy with anticipation, humanity has always looked up with a mixture of terror and awe. We see the flash of impossible light that tears the heavens asunder, followed by a roar that seems to shake the foundations of the world. For millennia, we called this power divine. We gave it names, whispered its legends, and in its untamed fury we saw the face of a god. In the modern age, that face has become familiar. A clean-shaven superhero, a member of a team of galactic adventurers. But this is a mere echo, a shadow of the original. To find the true god of the storm, we must peel back the layers of comic books and cinema. We must journey to the misty fjords and dark forests of ancient Scandinavia, where the stories were first told not on glossy paper, but roared across smoky mead halls by skalds and poets. This is the saga of the real Thor, a being of raw, elemental power, of fierce loyalty and even fiercer rage. A god whose story is not one of simple heroics, but of cosmic struggle, personal sacrifice, and the relentless war between order and chaos. And to understand this titan, we must begin where all stories do, at the beginning. This is the genesis of thunder. Thor's story begins with a union of impossible opposites. His father was Odin, the All-Father, king of the Aesir gods. Odin was the master of secrets, a god of wisdom, poetry, and the esoteric magic of the runes. He was a strategist, a wanderer, a king who sacrificed his own eye for a drink from the well of cosmic knowledge. Odin represented the mind, the sky, the relentless pursuit of power through cunning and foresight. He was the whisper in the halls of power, the raven on the wind, but Thor's mother was not some graceful goddess from Odin's court. His mother was Jörð, the earth itself. She was a Jotun, a giantess, one of the very beings the gods of Asgard considered their primordial enemies. She was the untamed wilderness, the unyielding granite of the mountains, the fertile soil, and the deep foundational strength of the world. Where Odin was the mind, Jörð was instinct. Where Odin was the sky, Jörð was the stone. And so Thor was born a living paradox, a child of two worlds, a son of both sky and earth. Within his veins flowed the cunning blood of the Aesir and the raw, untamable might of the giants. This unique heritage made him more than just another god. It made him the ultimate bridge between the celestial realm of Asgard and the world of mortals, Midgard, which he would one day swear to protect. From his first breath, he was different. His cries were the rumble of earthquakes, his fists clenched with the strength to shatter boulders. His hair was the color of fire, his beard a furious red, and his eyes held the electric spark of the storm. As he grew to manhood, Thor became the embodiment of strength and martial prowess. He married the beautiful goddess Sif, known for her magnificent hair, which flowed down her back like a cascade of liquid gold, a symbol of the golden wheat fields and the earth's fertility. Thor adored her, and in Sif, his explosive, thunderous nature found a calm and steadying harbor. But Asgard was also home to another force, Loki, the trickster, a god of fire and mischief, beautiful and silver-tongued, yet driven by a malicious and envious nature. Loki was Odin's blood brother and thus tolerated in Asgard, but he delighted in sowing discord. And one day, his cruel gaze fell upon Sif. In the dead of night, driven by nothing more than a whim of pure spite, Loki crept into Thor's bedchamber. With a magic blade, he shore off every last strand of Sif's glorious golden hair, leaving her bald, shamed, and heartbroken. When Thor awoke and saw what had been done, his grief quickly turned to an incandescent rage that shook Asgard to its core. The sky outside his hall, Mjölnir, turned black. Lightning scourged the mountains. This was not just an insult, it was a violation of his home, his wife, his honor. He found Loki, and the trickster's usual smirking demeanor vanished in the face of true, annihilating fury. Thor lifted Loki into the air, and with every word, a bone in the trickster's body creaked, threatening to shatter. He swore he would break every single bone Loki possessed, slowly and painfully. Terrified for his life, Loki swore an oath. He would go to the dwarves, the master craftsmen of the 9 realms, and he would have them forge a new head of hair for Sif, made of the purest gold that would grow on her head as if it were real. Only then did Thor release him, with a final, chilling promise of what would happen if he failed. Loki's journey took him down through the winding roots of the world tree, Yggdrasil, to the dark, subterranean realm of Svartalfheim. Here, amidst the clang of hammers and the roar of forges, lived the dwarves, beings of incredible skill, but also of great pride and greed. Loki first went to a pair of smiths known as the Sons of Ivaldi. They, intrigued by the challenge, not only forged a magnificent head of golden hair for Sif, but also 2 other masterpieces to show off their skill, a ship called Skidbladnir, which could be folded up to fit in one's pocket, but was large enough to hold all the gods, and a deadly spear named Hrungnir, which never missed its mark. Loki should have returned to Asgard then, his promise fulfilled. But his arrogance got the better of him. Holding the new treasures, he swaggered through Svartalfheim, boasting that no smiths were greater than the Sons of Ivaldi. This boast reached the ears of another pair of dwarven brothers, Brokkr and his brother, the master smith Eitri. Furious, Brokkr declared that he and his brother could forge 3 treasures that would surpass Loki's in every way. Loki, ever the gambler, immediately made a wager. He bet his own head that they could not. The stage was set for the greatest forging competition the 9 realms had ever known. Eitri placed a pig's skin in the forge and ordered Brokkr to work the bellows without stopping, no matter what. As Eitri left to work his magic, a large fly, Loki in disguise, landed on Brokkr's hand and bit him. Brokkr did not flinch. He pumped the bellows, and Eitri returned to pull from the fire a magnificent boar with bristles of pure gold, Gullinbursti. Next, Eitri placed gold in the forge. Again, he demanded Brokkr work the bellows without pause. The fly returned, this time landing on Brokkr's neck and biting twice as hard. Still, the dwarf endured. Eitri returned and drew out a golden ring of exquisite beauty, which he named Draupnir. Finally, Eitri placed a block of raw iron into the heart of the roaring furnace. "This will be the masterpiece," he warned. "Your pumping must be perfect. Any interruption, however small, will ruin it." As Brokkr began to pump, the fly returned for a final, desperate attack. It landed squarely between Brokkr's eyes and bit down with all its might. For a single fatal moment, blood streamed into the dwarf's eyes, blinding him. He instinctively let go of the bellows with one hand to swat the fly away. It was only for an instant, but it was enough. When Eitri returned, he pulled from the flames a mighty iron hammer. It glowed with immense power, a tool of terrifying potential. But because of that one moment of interruption, its handle was slightly too short. Eitri looked at it with a grimace. The flaw was undeniable. The hammer was named Mjölnir. The treasures were brought before the gods of Asgard for judgment. Loki presented his gifts first. He gave the spear Hrungnir to Odin, the ship Skidbladnir to the god Freyja, and the golden hair to Sif, which, upon touching her head, took root and grew just as Loki had promised. Then, Brokkr presented his treasures. He gave the ring Draupnir to Odin, explaining that every 9th night, 8 identical rings would drop from it, making it a source of endless wealth. He gave the golden boar, Gullinbursti, to Freyja, saying it could run faster than any horse through air or water, and its golden bristles would illuminate the darkest night. Finally, with a heavy heart, Brokkr came to Thor. He presented the hammer, Mjölnir. He explained its powers. It could shatter any mountain, it would never fail or break, and no matter how far it was thrown, it would always return to its master's hand. He also noted it could shrink to be hidden away if needed. Despite the short handle, Thor took the hammer in his grasp, and in that moment, god and weapon were united. He could feel its power, its connection to the storm, to his very being. The gods deliberated. All the treasures were magnificent, but one stood above all others. They declared that Mjölnir was the greatest treasure ever made, for it would be the ultimate defense for Asgard against the giants of Jotunheim. Brokkr had won the bet. Loki's face went pale. He had bet his own head, and the gods themselves had declared him the loser. Brokkr approached him, a grim smile on his face and a sharp knife in his hand, ready to claim his prize. "Wait," cried Loki, his mind racing. "You have a right to my head, this is true, but you have no claim upon my neck. The wager was for my head and my head only." The gods, ever fond of clever wordplay and legal loopholes, murmured in agreement. Brokkr was stumped. It was impossible to take Loki's head without cutting his neck. Cheated of his rightful vengeance, but not to be completely outdone, the dwarf came up with a new punishment. If he could not silence Loki's boasts by removing his head, he would do so by sealing his lips. He took a leather thong and a sharp awl. As other gods held the struggling trickster down, Brokkr pierced Loki's lips and stitched them tightly shut. For the first time in his life, the god of mischief was silenced, his mouth a scarred ruin. The pain was immense, but the humiliation was far worse. It would be a long time before Loki could speak again, and the scars would serve as a permanent reminder of the day his arrogance was met by dwarven craftsmanship and a god of thunder's rage. Thus, the greatest treasures of the gods were born from an act of malice, a foolish wager, and a moment of dwarven focus broken by the bite of a fly. Sif had her golden hair, Odin and Freya had their own magical artifacts, but it was Thor who received the ultimate weapon. He held Mjölnir in his hand. It felt less like a tool and more like a part of himself, an extension of his own stormy soul. But the raw, untamed cosmic energy humming within the hammer was immense, almost too much for even a god to handle. Eitri's forging was nearly perfect, but its power was wild. To control it, to truly become its master, Thor required two other items. The first was Mjölnir, his belt of strength. When he buckled this belt, his already immense godly power was instantly doubled, giving him the sheer physical might needed to brace against the hammer's recoil. The second was Jörmungandr, a pair of special iron gauntlets. Without these, no one, not even Thor, could grasp the short handle of Mjölnir and channel its devastating force. Now he was complete. The god of thunder, armed with his three-part arsenal, the belt to magnify his power, the gauntlets to handle the weapon, and Mjölnir, the crusher, to deliver the storm. His home in Asgard reflected this newfound status. It was a mighty hall named Mjölnir, which means lightning sky. With 540 rooms, it was the largest single structure in the realm of the gods, a fortress of stone and oak built to withstand the fury of 1,000 storms. It was not a place of delicate art or quiet contemplation. It was the bastion of a warrior, the home of a protector, and that became his sacred duty. While Odin worried about cosmic destiny and Loki schemed in the shadows, Thor's purpose was clear, direct, and unwavering. He was the champion of order, the guardian of the wall between the gods and their enemies. He was the protector of Asgard, but more than that, he became the protector of Midgard, the realm of humanity. Mortals looked to him not with the intellectual fear they held for Odin, but with a deep, abiding trust. He was their shield, their strong arm against the monstrous forces of chaos, the frost giants, the trolls, and the other horrors that lurked in the wild, dark places of the world. Thor, son of Odin and the earth, god of the storm, was now fully armed. His rage had been given a focus. His strength had been given a conduit. The universe had created a force of nature, and now the dwarves had given it a weapon. But a god is not defined by his possessions. He is defined by his deeds. And with Mjölnir in his hand, Thor's saga of epic battles and legendary journeys was only just beginning. He would soon learn that not all enemies could be crushed by a hammer, and not all battles could be won with strength. His first great journey would take him deep into the heart of Jotunheim, the land of giants, on a quest that would challenge his very perception of power and force him to confront a foe that was not made of flesh and bone, but of illusion itself. Join us next time as the god of thunder walks into the deceptive halls of Utgard. We have witnessed his genesis, a being born of sky and earth. We have seen his rage and how it led to the forging of Mjölnir, the greatest weapon in the 9 realms. Armed and armored, his power absolute and his purpose clear, the god of thunder now stood as the undisputed champion of Asgard, ready to face the forces of chaos. But strength, untempered by wisdom, is a blunt instrument, and Thor's first great journey would not be a simple battle of might, but a profound and humbling lesson, taught in the one place where a hammer blow means nothing, the heart of illusion. The tale begins not with a roar, but with a rumble of Thor's chariot, pulled across the sky by his 2 mystical goats, Hrungnir and Tangjoster. He was accompanied by the ever-present Loki, whose cunning he both distrusted and relied upon. Their journey took them to the fields of Midgard, where they sought lodging for the night with a family of peasant farmers. To repay their hospitality, Thor performed a ritual of his own. He slaughtered his goats, cooked their meat in a cauldron, and invited the family to share in the divine feast. He gave them but one warning: they could eat their fill, but they must not, under any circumstances, break any of the bones. They were to throw all the bones onto the goatskins laid out by the fire. But the farmer's son, a boy named Thialfi, was overcome with curiosity and hunger. He secretly took a thigh bone and with a small knife cracked it open to suck out the rich, savory marrow. The next morning, Thor took his hammer, Mjölnir, and held it over the pile of bones, sanctifying them. In a flash of light, the 2 goats sprang back to life, whole and healthy as ever, except for one. It was limping, its hind leg broken. Thor's good humor vanished in a clap of thunder. His knuckles turned white on the handle of his hammer, his eyes blazed with a terrifying light, and the poor farming family trembled before him, certain they were about to be annihilated. Seeing their genuine terror, however, Thor's rage cooled to a simmer. Instead of vengeance, he demanded recompense. The farmer's 2 children, the boy Thialfi and his sister Röskva, would become his servants, his bond servants, to follow and aid him on his journeys. And so, with his 2 new mortal companions and the ever-scheming Loki, Thor set out on foot, leaving his chariot behind. Their destination, Jotunheim, the land of the giants. After walking for an entire day, they found themselves in a vast, dark forest as night fell. They stumbled upon a strange and enormous building. The entrance was as wide and as tall as the building itself. Finding it empty, they decided to take shelter inside, but sleep did not come easily. Around midnight, the earth began to tremble violently. The entire hall shook, and a deep, guttural roaring echoed from outside. Terrified, Loki and the children huddled in a smaller side chamber, while Thor, ever the guardian, stood at the main entrance, Mjölnir in hand, ready to face whatever came. When dawn finally broke, Thor stepped outside and discovered the source of the noise. A giant of truly colossal size was sleeping on the ground nearby, and his snores were the earthquakes that had shaken them all night. As Thor stared, he realized the hall they had slept in was no building at all. It was the giant's glove, and the side chamber where the others had hidden was its thumb. The giant awoke, stretched, and introduced himself as Hrungnir, or Vast. He recognized Thor and, in a surprisingly friendly manner, proposed they travel together and share their provisions. Thor agreed, and Hrungnir bundled all their food into his own immense knapsack and slung it over his shoulder. They walked all day, the giant taking such huge strides that the others struggled to keep up. When night came again, Hrungnir found a spot beneath a large oak tree and promptly fell asleep, telling Thor he could help himself to the food in the bag. But when a hungry Thor tried to open the knapsack, he found it was tied with a series of impossible knots, bound with magical iron. He pulled and twisted, his divine strength failing him. His frustration grew into a cold rage. This giant was mocking him. He gripped Mjölnir, strode over to the sleeping Hrungnir, and with all his might, swung the hammer down upon the center of the giant's forehead. Hrungnir stirred. What was that? He mumbled, rubbing his head. Did a leaf fall on me from the tree? Thor, stunned into silence, retreated into the darkness. An hour later, as the giant's snores once again shook the forest, Thor decided to try again. He put his entire being into the next blow, swinging Mjölnir with such force that he could see the hammerhead sink deep into the giant's skull. Hrungnir woke again. "Ah, an acorn must have fallen on my head," he said, yawning. "How are you, Thor?" Thor was now utterly bewildered. How could this be? He, the strongest of the gods with the mightiest of weapons, was having no effect. He made a silent vow. If he had a chance for a third blow, it would be the last one Hrungnir ever felt. Just before dawn, he crept close one last time. He saw a vulnerable spot on the giant's temple, and he unleashed a final, cataclysmic strike. The hammer plunged into the skull up to its handle. Hrungnir sat up, rubbing his cheek. "There must be birds nesting in this tree," he grumbled. "A piece of twig just fell on me. Are you awake, Thor? It's time we were on our way." The giant then stood up, shouldered his bag, and told Thor he was heading in a different direction, but he pointed towards a great fortress in the distance. "That is the castle of Utgard," he said. "I've heard you gods are quite arrogant, but if you go there, you would be wise to tone it down. The followers of Utgard-Loki will not stand for the boasting of little runts like you." With that, Hrungnir departed into the forest, leaving Thor speechless, Mjölnir feeling strangely light in his hand. The four companions traveled onward, arriving at the fortress of Utgard. It was so immense, they had to crane their necks back until their spines ached just to see the top. The gate was locked, but the bars were set so far apart that they were able to squeeze through. They walked into a vast hall where rows of giants sat on benches, all of them larger than any Thor had seen before. At the far end sat their king, Utgard-Loki. The king looked down at them with a mocking smile. "Well, well," he boomed. "News travels slowly, it seems, if I am to believe this little fellow is the great Thor, but perhaps you are more than you appear. What skills do you and your companions possess? For no one is permitted to stay with us unless they can prove themselves a master of some craft or contest." Loki, ever vain, stepped forward first. "There is one craft I have mastered," he declared. "I can eat faster than anyone here." Utgard-Loki nodded. "A fine skill, if true. Let us put it to the test." He ordered his servants to bring in a long wooden trough filled with meat. A giant named Loki was chosen as Loki's opponent. They sat at opposite ends and began to eat. They met precisely in the middle, and it seemed a tie. But while Loki had eaten all the meat on his side, Loki had devoured the meat, the bones, and the wooden trough itself. Loki had lost. Next, young Thjalfi, known for his incredible speed, was challenged to a foot race. A slender youth named Hugi was brought forth. In the first race, Hugi was so far ahead he reached the finish line and turned to greet Thjalfi as he arrived. In the second race, the result was the same. In the third, Thjalfi was not even halfway down the course when Hugi had already won. Thjalfi, the swiftest of mortals, had been utterly defeated. Now all eyes turned to Thor. Utgard-Loki sneered. "Well, Thor, we have heard epic tales of your drinking. Let us see." A servant brought forth a large, curved drinking horn. "We consider it well drunk if you can empty it in a single gulp," the king explained. "Some need two, but no one is so poor a drinker that they cannot finish it in 3. Thor, confident in his capacity, put the horn to his lips and took the longest, deepest drink of his life until he was out of breath. But when he lowered the horn, the level of the liquid had barely dropped. Annoyed, he tried again, taking a second, even mightier gulp. The level went down, but the horn was still far from empty. Desperate and furious, he took a third and final drink, draining every last ounce of his strength. Still, a small amount of liquid remained. He had failed. Humiliated, Thor endured the giant's mocking laughter. "It seems your strength is not so great as we were told," said Utgard-Loki. "Perhaps you would like to try a simpler game, one our children play. Let us see you lift my cat from the floor." A large, grey cat padded into the hall. Thor, seeing this as a chance to redeem his honor, strode forward, placed his hands under the cat's belly and lifted with all his might, engaging the power of his belt, Mjölnir. The cat's back arched, but its feet remained firmly on the ground. He strained until the veins in his forehead stood out like cords, and managed only to lift one of the cat's paws from the floor. He had failed again. "Just as I thought," Utgard-Loki sighed dramatically. "The cat is too big and you are too small, but perhaps there is one last challenge. Let us see you wrestle my old nurse, Ellie." An ancient, withered old woman shuffled into the hall. Thor was insulted, but he saw no choice. He grappled with the old woman. To his astonishment, she was impossibly strong. He pushed, and she held her ground. He strained, and she forced him back. The harder Thor fought, the more his own strength seemed to fail him, until at last, after a long and grueling struggle, the old woman forced the god of thunder down onto one knee. The hall erupted. Thor, the mightiest being in the 9 realms, had been defeated by an old woman. The contests were over. Thor and his companions had been humbled. They were given lodging for the night, though they could barely eat for their shame. The next morning, Utgard-Loki himself led them out of the fortress. Once they were clear of its walls, he stopped and finally spoke the truth. "Now that you are out," he said, his voice losing its mocking tone, "I will tell you what truly happened. For as long as I live, you will never enter my fortress again. I have defended it with magic and illusion. I was the giant, Hrungnir, whom you met in the forest. The knapsack was bound by spells, and the 3 blows you struck me with your hammer, they did not miss. I placed a mountain between me and your blows. Look over there." Thor looked and saw a great mountain with 3 deep, square valleys carved into its peak. "Those are the marks of your hammer." "The contests," he continued, "were also illusions. Loki was hungry, but his opponent Logi was wildfire itself, which consumes all. Thialfi is the swiftest of runners, but his opponent Hugi was thought, and nothing can outrun thought. And you, Thor, your might is more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The horn you drank from, its other end was in the sea. When you return to the coast, you will see how much the ocean itself has receded. You created the tides. The cat you could barely lift. That was no cat. That was Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, which coils around the entire world. You stretched him so far that his head nearly touched his tail. You almost tore the universe apart. And the old woman you wrestled, Ellie, she was old age itself. No one, god or mortal, can ever defeat old age. It is the fate of all to one day fall to her. I saw your true power," Utgard-Loki confessed, "and it terrified me. Now go and never return." Thor listened, his shame turning to a colossal rage at the depth of the deception. He gripped Mjölnir, turned to smash the sorcerer and his lying fortress to dust, but there was nothing there. Utgard-Loki and his entire castle had vanished without a trace. He was left standing alone in an empty field, his companions beside him, his hammer in hand. His power had been confirmed as world-altering, yet he had been defeated. He had been made a fool. And as he turned his back on that empty space and began the long walk home, the god of thunder was quieter, more thoughtful. He had learned the hardest lesson of his long life, that there are some forces in the universe that cannot be met with strength, and some enemies that cannot be crushed by a hammer. The journey home from Utgard was a long and silent one. The humiliation of his defeat, a trick of the mind and the eye, had left a bitter taste in Thor's mouth. He, the god of thunder, whose strength could move the very oceans, had been brought to his knees by an old woman who was nothing more than an idea. Back in Asgard, among the solid, honest halls of Mjölnir, he felt a simmering need. A need for a fight that was true. A battle of stone against hammer, of strength against strength, with no tricks, no illusions. He craved a challenge that was real, and the cosmos, in its infinite irony, was about to grant his wish. This time, the story begins not with Thor, but with his father. Odin the All-Father, ever restless, mounted his 8-legged steed, Sleipnir, and rode out from Asgard, his purpose his own. He galloped across the Bifrost Bridge and down into Jotunheim, the wind whipping at his cloak. There he came upon a giant, renowned among his kind as the strongest of all. His name was Hrungnir. The giant's head and heart were made of solid, unyielding stone, and he rode a magnificent stallion named Gullfaxi, the Golden Mane. Hrungnir saw Odin and sneered. "That is a fine horse you ride, old man," he boomed, "but I would wager my own steed, Gullfaxi, is faster." Odin's pride, a force as potent as any giant's strength, was stung. "A wager, then," he declared, his one eye glinting. And so the race began. 2 champions, a god king and a giant lord, thundered across the plains of Jotunheim. Sleipnir's 8 legs were a blur of motion, a frantic, galloping rhythm that ate up the miles. Gullfaxi was a storm of raw power, his golden mane flowing like a comet's tail. For leagues they raced, neck and neck, but in the end, the unnatural gait of Sleipnir proved superior. Odin won, but victory can breed folly. In a moment of misplaced magnanimity, Odin invited the vanquished and furious Hrungnir back to Asgard to drink ale and soothe his wounded pride. It was a catastrophic error in judgment. Within the hallowed walls of Valhalla, the gods served the giant their finest ale. But the drink of the gods was too strong for a being of stone and rage. Hrungnir became roaring drunk. He slammed his fists on the table, silencing the hall. "I will tear this roof from its pillars," he bellowed, his voice cracking the very rafters. "I will slay all you whimpering gods and cast Asgard into the sea, all. Except for the lovely Freya and Thor's wife, Sif. I will take them back with me to serve my drinks and warm my bed." The gods were horrified, yet bound by the sacred laws of hospitality, which forbade them from harming a guest, no matter how vile. They could only watch in silence as the goddess Freya, trembling with rage, was forced to refill the giant's horn. It was she who finally spoke. "There is only one in Asgard who can answer this insolence," she said. "Summon Thor." The call went out. Thor had been away in the eastern realms, fighting trolls as was his custom. When he returned and strode into Valhalla, he stopped dead. He saw the drunken giant, the terrified gods, and he heard the vile threats against his own wife. His face became a mask of cold fury. The laws of hospitality were a whisper against the hurricane of his wrath. He raised Mjölnir. "Who invited this dog to drink here?" he roared. "And why is he still breathing?" "Hold Thor," Hrungnir shouted, the ale fumes clearing from his head at the sight of the enraged thunderer. "It would be a coward's act to strike an unarmed guest. If you have the courage, meet me for a formal duel, a homegang, at the border of our lands at Jörmungandr. There we shall see who is the true champion." A formal duel, a test of pure strength. It was exactly what Thor's soul craved. "I accept," he growled. News of the coming duel spread like wildfire across Jotunheim. The giants knew of Mjölnir, and they feared for their champion. To aid him, they undertook a monstrous task. They constructed a man of clay, a giant decoy 9 leagues high, and named him Mokakalfi, or Mist Calf. He was a terrifying sight, but inside his massive chest, they placed the heart of a mare, and it trembled with a relentless, cowardly fear. Meanwhile, Hrungnir armed himself. He took up his shield of solid flint and wielded a gigantic whetstone as his club. His stone heart beat a slow, steady rhythm in his chest, knowing no fear. On the appointed day, Thor arrived at Jörmungandr, the dueling grounds. With him was his swift servant, Thialfi. As the colossal form of Hrungnir appeared on the horizon, Thialfi sprinted ahead. "A word of warning, mighty Hrungnir," the boy shouted. "Thor has seen you. He plans to attack you from beneath the earth." Hrungnir, believing the trick, made a fatal mistake. He threw his massive shield onto the ground and stood upon it, protecting himself from below, but leaving his head and torso completely exposed. At that moment, the sky darkened. Thor appeared, lightning crackling around him. He did not hesitate. With a great cry, he hurled Mjölnir through the air. Seeing the hammer coming, Hrungnir swung his whetstone club and threw it with all his might to intercept the blow. The two weapons met in a cataclysmic explosion in mid-air. The whetstone shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, which rained down across Midgard, becoming all the whetstone deposits in the world. But one large, razor-sharp shard flew onward, striking Thor squarely in the forehead and burying itself deep in the bone. Though wounded, Thor remained standing. And Mjölnir, its path barely altered, flew on. It struck Hrungnir's stone skull with the force of a falling star. The giant's head did not crack, it vaporized. The mightiest champion of the giants fell to the earth, a headless corpse. As for the great clay decoy, Mjölnir, it is said that at the mere sight of the enraged and wounded Thor, the golem wet itself in terror and crumbled into a muddy heap, easily dispatched by Thialfi. Thor had won. But as the adrenaline faded, the pain from his wound overwhelmed him, and he collapsed. As he fell, the dead body of Hrungnir toppled onto him, its colossal leg pinning him to the ground. The gods rushed to his side. One by one, they tried to lift the giant's leg, but none had the strength. Not even Odin, the All-Father, could move it. It was then that a new figure appeared on the battlefield. It was Magni, Thor's son by the giantess Jörmungandr. He was only 3 nights old, but he possessed the unbridled strength of both his lineages. "It is a shame, father," the boy said, "that I arrived so late. I could have killed this giant with my bare hands." And with that, the 3-year-old child reached down and with no effort at all, lifted the giant's leg, freeing his father. Thor rose, beaming with pride. "You will be a great warrior, my son," he said, and as a reward, he gave the boy Hrungnir's prized horse, Gulfaxi. But the matter of the whetstone in his head remained. Back in Asgard, the gods summoned a powerful sorceress, a Völva named Groa. She began to chant a magical song, a long and winding incantation to draw the stone from Thor's flesh. As she sang, Thor could feel the stone loosening, the pain easing. Overjoyed and wishing to encourage her, he decided to give her some good news. "Groa," he said, "I have recently returned from the north. I rescued a man from the giants, carrying him across the rivers on my back. I believe he is your long-lost husband," Groa gasped. The joy and shock of the news shattered her concentration. The intricate threads of her magical song unraveled. She forgot the words. The spell was broken. The stone in Thor's forehead stopped moving, forever fixed in place. And so, Thor carried with him for the rest of his days a permanent reminder of his greatest duel, a shard of his enemy lodged in his own brow, a testament to a victory won not with tricks or illusions, but with pure, unadulterated, thunderous might. The duel with Hrungnir had settled a score. It was a victory of pure strength, a bloody and satisfying affair that washed away the shame of Utgard's illusions. Thor was once again the undisputed champion, his name a thunderclap in the halls of his enemies. He carried the giant's whetstone in his brow as a trophy, a mark of honor. Yet, in the quiet that followed, a different memory began to surface. Not of the stone giant he had shattered, but of the great grey cat he could not lift. The cat that was no cat, but a serpent so vast it encircled the entire world of men. Jörmungandr, a child of Loki, a monster cast into the ocean by Odin himself, an enemy he had touched, but not faced. A loose thread in the tapestry of his life. A restlessness grew in Thor's soul, a primal urge to seek out this monster, not because of any new insult, but because destiny demanded it. He had to look his fated adversary in the eye. He set out alone, traveling not as a god in his goat-drawn chariot, but disguised as a young, strapping mortal boy. His journey took him to the edge of the world, to the icy coast where the giant Hrungnir lived. Thor appeared at the giant's door and offered to help him with his fishing on the morrow. Hrungnir looked the boy up and down, scoffing at his youth. "A little runt like you won't be much help to me," the giant grumbled. "And if you're coming, you'll have to find your own bait." "Don't you worry about bait," Thor said, a dangerous glint in his eye. He walked out to Hrungnir's prized herd of oxen and without hesitation found the largest bull. He seized the great beast by the horns and with a single sharp twist wrung its neck. He tore the bull's head from its body and returned to the stunned giant. "I have my bait," he announced. The next morning, a pale and uneasy Hrungnir launched his boat with Thor. They rowed out, and Hrungnir soon stopped at his usual fishing grounds where he caught a pair of whales. "This is far enough," he said, but Thor insisted they go further. "The real fish," he taunted, "are in the deep." He took the oars himself and began to row with a power that terrified Hrungnir, pulling them far out past the edge of Midgard, into the primordial ocean where monsters sleep. "Stop," Hrungnir cried, his voice trembling. "We have gone too far. We are over the lair of the Midgard Serpent." "This is where we fish," Thor replied grimly. He prepared his equipment. It was no ordinary fishing line, but a cable of impossible strength, forged for a god. To it he fastened a hook the size of a man's arm, and upon that hook he impaled the bloody head of the ox. He cast it over the side, and the bait sank into the black, silent depths. Down below, in the eternal darkness, Jörmungandr, the World Serpent, tasted the blood in the water. It smelled the meat of the ox. It opened its colossal, venom dripping more, and swallowed the bait whole. The massive iron hook tore into the roof of its mouth, sinking deep into its palate. A pain like it had never known shot through the serpent. It convulsed in a spasm of agony and rage. The serpent's thrashing was so violent that the entire world shook. Mountains crumbled, the plains of Midgard buckled, and far away in Asgard, the gods were thrown from their high seats. In the boat, the line went taut with a sound like a cracking glacier. Thor was ready. He wrapped the line around his hands and planted his feet. The pull was so immense, so cosmically powerful, that his legs burst through the hull of Hrungnir's boat. He did not sink. His feet found the very bottom of the ocean, and standing there, braced against the seabed itself, the god of thunder began to pull. It was a battle of two primordial forces. The god who protected the world against the serpent that encircled it. The ocean boiled and churned around them, rising in tidal waves that crashed against distant shores. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, Thor dragged his enemy upwards. Then, the surface of the sea broke apart, and the head of the Midgard serpent rose from the depths. It was a sight of ultimate horror. Eyes as old as time, filled with a cold, intelligent malice, stared directly into Thor's own. Its scales were the size of shields, and from its fangs dripped a black venom that sizzled as it hit the water, a poison potent enough to kill anything it touched. For a long moment, god and monster, fated enemies, hung there in a tense, hateful silence. This was the true face of chaos. A great, triumphant roar ripped from Thor's throat. He let go of the line with one hand and reached for Mjölnir. This was it. A chance to end it all, here and now, to shatter the prophecy and kill his nemesis before the final battle of Ragnarok. He raised the hammer high, its iron head gathering the storm. But in the boat, Hrungnir the giant was paralyzed with a terror beyond imagining. He saw the end of the world in the serpent's eyes. He saw the ocean swallowing the sky. His mind snapped. In a fit of pure panic, he fumbled for his bait knife. Just as Thor swung the hammer down with all his world-breaking force, Hrungnir lunged forward and slashed the line. The great cable snapped. With a shriek that was half pain and half triumph, the serpent's head sank back beneath the waves, disappearing into the black depths. It was gone. The silence that followed was more terrible than any roar. Thor stood frozen, his hammer held high, his killing blow having struck nothing but air. He had been denied. Victory, absolute and world-altering, had been stolen from him by the cowardice of a fool. His rage, when it came, was a supernova. He turned to Hrungnir, and with the back of his hand, struck the giant with such force that he was launched from the boat, tumbling into the maelstrom and sinking without a trace. Thor did not watch him drown. He was alone, standing on the ocean floor in his wrecked boat, staring at the empty water where his destiny had just vanished. He had not won, he had not lost. He had simply looked his end in the eye, and it had been snatched away. He waded back to the shores of Midgard, the waves lapping at his feet, his great prize lost. The final battle had been averted, but the prophecy was now sealed in hate. They would meet again, and next time there would be no escape. The encounter with the World Serpent left a mark on Thor's soul deeper than any physical scar. He had faced the abyss and returned, his legend growing ever larger. In the halls of Asgard and the minds of men, he was no longer just a champion. He was a cosmic force, the bulwark against the tide of chaos. His hammer, Mjölnir, became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of absolute security, the ultimate deterrent. Thor himself, perhaps, grew comfortable in this knowledge. He would lay his hammer by his side as he slept, confident in its power, never imagining a world where he could wake up and find it simply gone. But one morning, that is precisely what happened, Thor awoke with a jolt. His hand shot out to the space beside him, a motion as instinctive as breathing. It met only empty air. He sat up, his mind clouded with sleep. He patted the bed, then the floor. A knot of confusion tightened in his stomach. He threw back the furs, his search becoming more frantic. The confusion curdled into disbelief, then disbelief into a dawning, icy horror that quickly ignited into pure, unreasoning panic. Mjölnir was gone. The god of thunder let out a roar of such rage and terror that his great hall, Hrungnir, shook to its very foundations. This was not just a theft. It was a violation that left him and all of Asgard naked and vulnerable. His first and only suspect was Loki. He stormed from his hall, found the trickster, and seized him with a grip that threatened to crush bone. "Tell me now, you spawn of evil," Thor bellowed, his face inches from Loki's. "Did you hide my hammer?" For once, Loki was innocent, and his terror was genuine. "By all the oaths of Asgard, I swear it was not I," he stammered, seeing the gravity of the situation. "If Mjölnir is truly gone, the giants will be at our walls before the next moon. We must find it." Recognizing the truth in Loki's words, Thor released him. "What is your counsel?" he demanded. Loki, his mind already working, suggested they go to the goddess Freya. They needed her magical falcon cloak, a feathered cape that would allow one of them to fly and search the 9 realms. Freya, understanding the catastrophic danger they were all in, agreed to lend it. Loki wrapped the feathered cloak around his shoulders and, with a great beat of wings, launched himself into the sky, flying towards the grim, mountainous realm of Jotunheimr. There, sitting on a burial mound, he saw the king of the giants, a loutish creature named Thrym. The giant was busy braiding golden leashes for his hunting dogs and trimming the manes of his horses. "What news from the Aesir?" Thrym boomed as Loki landed. "Why have you come alone to the land of giants?" "The news is ill," Loki said, his voice sharp. "Have you hidden the hammer of Thor?" Thrym let out a great, booming laugh. "Of course I have," he boasted. "I have buried it 8 miles deep beneath the earth, and no one shall ever see it again unless you bring me what I desire. Go back and tell the gods that the price for the hammer is the hand of Freya in marriage." Loki flew back to Asgard, the giant's arrogant words ringing in his ears. He delivered the ultimatum to Thor, and together they went to Freya. "Put on your bridal veil, my lady," Thor said bluntly. "You and I are taking a ride to Jotunheimr," Freya exploded. A rage so profound, so utterly incandescent, burst from her that the very halls of the gods trembled, and her famed necklace, the Brisingamen, shattered from her neck and fell to the floor. You must think me the most desperate man, crazy goddess in all the realms to even suggest I would travel with you to marry a giant, she seethed. Her refusal was absolute. The gods convened an emergency council. The situation was desperate. Their greatest weapon was held for a ransom they could not pay. As they sat in grim silence, it was Heimdall, the white god, the ever-watchful guardian of the Bifrost, who offered a plan. A plan so bizarre, so utterly absurd, that at first no one spoke. "There is only one way," Heimdall said, his voice calm and clear. "We must dress Thor himself as the bride. Let us put the bridal veil on him and hang Freya's necklace around his neck." Thor erupted. "What are you saying?" he roared, his face turning a shade of purple. "The gods will call me unmanly. The giants will mock me for eternity. I will not be dressed as a woman." But Loki, his fear now replaced by a spark of pure, malicious amusement, saw the plan's genius. "Be silent, Thor," the trickster said. "This is our only choice. If you do not retrieve your hammer, the giants will storm Asgard's gates and make this their home. Your pride is a small price to pay for our survival." And so, with a heavy heart and a murderous glare, Thor submitted. The gods set to work on the most ridiculous task of their long lives. They draped a gown over his mountainous, muscular frame. They hung a set of tinkling keys from his belt, as was the custom for a bride. They placed Freya's Brisingamen around his thick neck, and finally, they covered his ferocious, red, bearded face with a delicate bridal veil. The god of thunder was now a bride. "And I," Loki chirped, a wicked grin spreading across his face, "shall go with you as your bridesmaid. We shall make a lovely pair." The two gods, one a hulking, veiled bride, the other a lithe, giggling bridesmaid, rode Thor's chariot to Jotunheim. Thrym was overjoyed. He ordered his servants to prepare the grandest wedding feast. "Hurry," he commanded. "Spread straw on the benches. Freya, daughter of Njord, is here to be my wife," the feast began. And Thrym soon noticed his bride had a rather unusual appetite. Thor, sitting veiled at the head of the table, consumed an entire ox, 8 whole salmon, and all the sweet delicacies that had been prepared for the women. He then washed this down with 3 full barrels of mead. Thrym stared, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I have never seen a maiden eat with such gusto," he exclaimed. "Nor a bride drink so much mead." The quick-witted bridesmaid, Loki, leaned in conspiratorially. "My lord Thrym," he whispered, "the Lady Freya has been so consumed with desire for you, so excited to come to Jotunheim, that she has not eaten a single bite for 8 long days and nights." This pleased the vain giant. "Ah, I see," he said. He leaned forward to steal a kiss, lifting the edge of the veil. He immediately leaped back from the table in terror. "Why are Freya's eyes so fearsome?" he cried. "They burn with a terrible fire." Loki, once again, saved the day. "My lord," he said smoothly, "the Lady Freya has been so overcome with longing for this wedding that she has not slept for 8 long nights. That is why her eyes burn so." Convinced, Thrym stood and called for the end of the feast and the beginning of the wedding rite. "Bring forth the hammer," he commanded. "Bring Mjölnir to place in the maiden's lap and sanctify our sacred union." His servants brought the hammer into the hall. The short-handled, iron weapon, the source of all their hope and fear, they laid it reverently across the lap of the veiled bride. The moment Thor's fingers closed around the familiar handle of his hammer, a great, silent laugh shook his heart. He felt his power, his very essence, rush back into him. The farce was over. He stood, tearing the veil from his face to reveal the blazing eyes and snarling, red, bearded face of the god of thunder. The giants gasped in horror. The first to die was Thrym, his skull crushed into a bloody pulp by a single vengeful blow. Thor then turned to the rest. In a storm of violence, he systematically annihilated Thrym's entire clan, the wedding feast turning into a bloodbath. The halls of the giant king rang not with celebration, but with the screams of the dying and the thunderous cracks of Mjölnir. When it was over, Thor stood, breathing heavily amidst the carnage. He was once again whole. His hammer was home. The victory feast in Thrym's hall was the last great laugh the gods of Asgard would ever truly share. Thor's triumph was absolute, a story of cunning and catharsis that would be told and retold with relish. But even as the echoes of that slaughter faded, a chill began to creep into the air of the Nine Realms. The age of grand, straightforward adventures was closing. The choices of the gods, their broken oaths and compromised honor, were beginning to bear a dark and bitter fruit. The sky itself seemed to be darkening, not with a coming storm that Thor could command, but with the shadow of a fate they had forged for themselves. The first seeds of this doom had been planted long ago with the children of Loki. The gods had seen the danger in the great wolf Fenrir. They had watched him grow at a terrifying rate, his strength becoming a palpable threat to their existence. Twice they had tried to bind him with mighty chains, and twice he had snapped them with ease. For the third attempt, they had the dwarves forge a chain that was slight and silken to the touch, but made of impossible things: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain. It was called Gleipnir. To convince the wolf to be bound by it, the god Tyr, known for his honor, placed his own hand in Fenrir's mouth as a pledge of good faith. When the wolf found he could not break this magical ribbon and realized he had been tricked, he bit down, and Tyr became the one-handed god. The gods had preserved their safety, but they had done so through deceit, breaking a sacred oath. A rot had entered their bones, and Thor had stood by, his face a grim mask of approval, knowing the dishonor was necessary, but dishonor nonetheless. But the true turning point, the event that shattered the world's joy forever, was the death of Balder. Balder the Beautiful, the son of Odin and Frigg, the wisest, gentlest, and most beloved of all the gods. He was plagued by dreams of his own death, and so his mother, Frigg, traveled the 9 realms, extracting a solemn oath from all things fire and water, iron and stone, plant and animal, that they would never harm her son. Now seemingly invulnerable, Balder became the center of a new, divine pastime for the gods. They would gather and throw weapons at him: axes, spears, stones, and roar with laughter as each object veered away, leaving him completely untouched. It was a celebration of their triumph over fate. But Loki, his heart black with envy, would not stand for it. Disguised as an old woman, he went to Frigg and coaxed from her the one secret she had overlooked. "All things have sworn an oath," she admitted, "except for the little mistletoe. It seemed too young and harmless to ask." Loki went at once and found the mistletoe. He fashioned a sharpened dart from its wood and returned to the gods' games. He saw the blind god, Hodder, standing sadly at the edge of the circle, unable to participate. "Why don't you throw something to honor your brother?" Loki whispered, pressing the dart into Hodder's hand. "I will guide your arm." Hodder, trusting, agreed. He threw the mistletoe dart with all his might. It flew straight and true, piercing Balder's heart. The beautiful god fell to the ground, dead. The laughter of the gods died in their throats, replaced by a wail of grief so profound it shook the foundations of Asgard. The light had gone out of their world. They prepared the greatest funeral pyre ever conceived upon Balder's own great ship, Hrungnir. The grief of the gods was a terrible thing to behold, but Thor's sorrow manifested, as it always did, as pure, unthinking rage. As the gods prepared the pyre, a dwarf named Litter scurried in front of him. In a blind fit of temper, without thought or malice, Thor simply kicked the dwarf, sending him flying into the flames to be consumed alongside Balder. He then raised his hammer, his face streaked with tears, and sanctified the pyre with Mjölnir. The age of joy was over. In the grim silence that followed Balder's death, The gods gathered for a feast, but there was no mirth. It was into this gathering that Loki, now an outcast and a murderer, brazenly walked. What followed was the Lokasana, Loki's flighting, a torrent of poison that would sunder the gods forever. One by one, he moved through the hall, his silver tongue a blade, exposing their deepest secrets, their most painful shames, their adulteries, their cowardice, their compromises. The gods could only sit and listen, their faces pale, for his words held the sting of truth. He was in the middle of mocking Sif for her infidelity when the hall doors burst open. Thor stood there, returned from his journeys. He was a figure of pure menace, his knuckles white on his hammer, his eyes burning. He was the only one in the hall whom Loki truly feared. "Be silent, you wretched creature," Thor growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "My hammer, Mjölnir, will shut your mouth for good." Loki, though afraid, could not resist one last taunt. "Ah, the son of Earth is here," he sneered. "You talk big, but you cowered in the thumb of Skrymir's glove, didn't you?" Thor took a step forward. "Be silent, or I will smash your head from your shoulders." "You would not dare," Loki taunted. "You fled from the World Serpent." Thor took another step, raising Mjölnir. "One more word, and I will hurl you to the east, where you will never be seen again." Loki's nerve finally broke. He had faced down every other god with words, but against Thor's raw, physical promise of annihilation, there was no defense. He fled the hall. The final bond between the gods and Loki was broken. They hunted him down, capturing him as he hid in the form of a salmon in a river. His punishment was the most horrific they could conceive. They dragged him to a dark, dripping cave. They bound him to 3 sharp rocks with bindings made from the entrails of his own murdered son. Above his head, the goddess Skadi placed a giant serpent, its fangs perpetually dripping burning venom onto his face. The age of mischief was over. The age of bitter consequence had begun. Thor, his face set like stone, had been a part of it all, the broken oaths, the grieving rage, the final, terrible justice. The world was now poised on a knife's edge, and the only thing holding back the coming darkness was the grim, silent sentinel with a hammer in his hand and a shard of stone in his brow. The age of the gods was ending in blood and sorrow. With Balder dead and Loki bound, a grim silence fell upon Asgard. It was the quiet before the end of all things. A prophecy, long foretold, began to unwind its final, terrible threads. It began with a winter. A winter that did not end. It was Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter. For 3 years, snow fell from all corners of the sky, and no summer came to relieve it. The bonds of kinship dissolved in the desperate, frozen world of men. Brother killed brother for food, fathers betrayed sons, and all honor was lost in the struggle for survival. Then, the sky itself began to die. The 2 great wolves who had chased the sun and moon since the beginning of time, Skirl and Hati, finally caught their prey. One devoured the sun, the other the moon, and the world was plunged into a cold, eternal twilight. The stars vanished. The earth began to shudder and groan. The great world tree, Yggdrasil, trembled from its roots to its highest branches. In the ensuing quake, all bonds were broken. The chains holding the wolf Fenrir snapped. The bindings on the trickster god Loki crumbled to dust. From his high perch in Asgard, the guardian Heimdall saw it all. He saw the armies of chaos gathering. He raised the Gjala horn to his lips and blew a single, soul-shattering blast that echoed through the dying worlds. It was the final alarm. The war had come. In Asgard, Odin donned his golden helmet, grasped his spear Hrungnir, and led the shimmering host of the Einherjar, the dead warriors of Valhalla, out onto the battlefield of Vigrid. But the forces arrayed against them were a tide of nightmares. From the south came the fire giants of Muspelheim, led by Surtur, his sword of flame burning brighter and hotter than any sun. From the north, The ship Naglfar, built from the uncut fingernails of the dead, sailed towards them, captained by a freed and hate-filled Loki. The frost giants marched, their footsteps the sound of grinding glaciers. The great hound of hell, Garma, broke its chain. Fenrir, the wolf, now unbound, loped onto the field, his lower jaw scraping the earth, his upper jaw touching the sky, fire blazing from his eyes and nostrils. And from the sea, the world itself uncoiled. Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, rose from the depths in a tidal wave of fury. He surged towards the land, his gargantuan body churning the ocean into a black poison, spewing venom that filled the air and stained the sky. This was Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. As Odin rode to meet his doom in the jaws of Fenrir, as Tyr marched towards his mutual destruction with the hound Garma, as Heimdall and Loki rushed towards their final, hateful embrace, Thor had only one destination. His face was a mask of grim purpose. The shard of stone in his forehead was a dull, constant ache. He did not look at the chaos around him. He did not look at the fall of Asgard's heroes. He marched past the dying and the damned, his eyes fixed on the poisoned shoreline. He strode towards the thrashing, world-ending form of his oldest enemy. His destiny, the serpent saw him. It turned its colossal head, its ancient eyes filled with a venomous hate that had festered since their last encounter. It rose from the water to meet him, and the final battle began. It was a conflict on a scale the universe had never before witnessed. Thor was the storm incarnate, Mjölnir a blur of motion, calling down lightning that sizzled and steamed on the serpent's wet scales. He waded into the venomous surf, his war cries drowned out by the hiss of the beast and the crash of the poisoned waves. Jörmungandr was a vortex of primordial chaos, coiling and striking, its fangs dripping a black ichor that could boil the very sea. They fought amidst the wreckage of the dying world, a god and a monster locked in a dance of mutual annihilation. For what seemed an eternity, they battled, neither gaining an advantage. The ground cracked beneath Thor's feet. The serpent's coils crushed mountains. But then, as the great beast reared back to deliver a final, venomous strike, Thor saw his opening. He let out a final, defiant roar, a sound of pure, concentrated thunder. He put all of his being, all of his strength, all of his rage and sorrow for his dying world into one last, perfect blow. He swung Mjölnir down upon the serpent's vast, gaping head. The impact was not a crack, but a sound like a continent breaking in two, bone shattered. The serpent's final scream was a death rattle that echoed across the poisoned sea. Jörmungandr, the World Serpent, the child of Loki, crashed back into the waves, dead. Thor had fulfilled his purpose. He was the serpent slayer. He stood victorious, breathing heavily, his body battered, but only for a moment. In its death throes, the monster had succeeded. It had spewed its black, lethal poison all over him, covering him from head to toe. A fire, unlike any other, began to burn in his veins. He felt his divine strength, the strength that had held back the giants and shaken the foundations of the earth, failing him. He turned his back on his lifeless foe and began to stagger towards the dead land. He knew his time was over. With a will of iron, he forced one foot in front of the other, one step. His vision blurred. 2, the sky already dark turned black. 3, Mjölnir felt impossibly heavy. 4, he thought of Sif. 5, he thought of his sons Magni and Modi. 6, the fire reached his heart. 7, his legs trembled. 8, he was the protector of Midgard. 9, on the 9th and final step, his strength gave out entirely. The mighty hammer Mjölnir fell from his grasp and hit the earth with a dull thud. A torrent of black poison erupted from Thor's mouth. He fell forward, and the god of thunder, the champion of Asgard, the protector of mankind, lay dead upon the poisoned soil of his world. The twilight of the gods was complete. Surtur, the fire giant, swept his flaming sword across creation, and the world burned. The earth, scorched and blackened, groaned one last time and sank beneath the waves. There was nothing left, only darkness and silence and the sea. The end was absolute. The ash of the world tree, Yggdrasil, settled on a black, silent sea. There was no sky, no earth, no life. The age of gods and giants was over, drowned and burned and forgotten in the final, all-consuming darkness. The saga was finished, but the universe does not abide a vacuum. Slowly, after an age of silence, the waters began to calm. The black poison receded, and from the depths, a new world rose. It was green and beautiful and pure. Rivers flowed with clean water, and fields grew unsown with corn. A new sun, the beautiful daughter of the one devoured by the wolf, rose in the sky, her light warm and gentle, holding none of the old world's sorrow. It was a world reborn, and it was not empty. From the land of the dead, two figures emerged, blinking in the new light. It was Balder the Beautiful, returned from hell, his brother Hodder beside him. The murder that had begun the end was forgiven, washed away by the sea of fire. They were joined by the sons of Odin, Vidar and Vali, their purpose of vengeance now complete. They gathered on the plains of Idavolla, where Asgard's golden halls once stood. In the green grass, they found the golden game pieces of the old gods, and they sat and spoke of what was lost. They talked of the runes, of the World Serpent, and of the great gods who had fallen. They spoke of Odin, the All-Father, and they spoke of Thor. Thor was gone, but his legacy was not. For two more figures had survived the inferno. Thor's own sons, Magni, whose name means strength, and Modi, whose name means courage. They had weathered the storm, and as they walked across the new green earth, they found it. Lying in the grass, humming with a quiet inner power, was Mjölnir. The hammer had not been destroyed, it had endured. Magni and Modi, the heirs of thunder, took up the hammer. It was their inheritance. Thor's body had fallen, but his essence lived on. His strength in Magni, his fierce spirit in Modi, and his power, the power to protect the new world, now rested in their hands. The thunder had not been silenced, it had merely been passed to a new generation. And what of humanity? Two mortals had survived, a man and a woman named Lif and Lifthrasir. They had hidden themselves within the trunk of the world tree, and they emerged now onto the fresh earth. From them, a new humanity would spring, to live in peace in a world free from the strife of the old gods. Here, the myth ends, but the story of Thor does not. To truly understand him, we must step back from the tale of Ragnarok and ask, who was this god to the people who carved his runes and whispered his name against the storm? He was not the distant, intellectual, and often terrifying Odin. Thor was the god of the common man. He was the champion of the farmer, the sailor, the builder, the warrior. His strength was straightforward, his purpose clear. He was their protector. His thunder was the sound of a guardian, not a tyrant. When a Viking farmer saw a storm brewing, he did not only see a threat to his crops. He saw his god riding out to fight the giants, the forces of frost and chaos that perpetually threatened their world. Across the lands of the Norse, archaeologists have found thousands of his symbols. Tiny hammers, Mjölnirs, forged from iron and silver, worn as pendants. These were not mere decoration. They were a statement of faith, a plea for protection, a symbol of strength worn against the chest. In an age of violent change, as the white Christ of the South spread across Europe, to wear the hammer was a defiant act of loyalty to the old ways, to the old gods. To Thor, his greatest stories were not just told, they were carved into stone for all to see. Runestones still stand today bearing the images of his great deeds. Thor in a boat, his leg bursting through the hull, pulling on a line connected to a great serpent. Thor facing down the giant Hrungnir, his hammer held high. These were not fables, they were founding truths, etched into the very landscape. And so we are left with a final question. Why, after so many centuries, does his story still echo? Why does the god of thunder still fascinate us? Perhaps it is because he is an archetype that we will always understand and always need. He is the embodiment of protective force. He is the courage required to face one's destiny, even a destiny that promises death. He is the simple, direct strength that is sometimes necessary when cunning and diplomacy have failed. He is the fierce, unwavering guardian who stands on the wall and says to the chaos beyond, "You shall not pass." The mythological life of Thor is over. His battles are won, his fate is met, but his saga is eternal. His thunder was silenced on the field of Vigrid, but it was not the end. It echoes still. It echoes in every crashing storm that rolls across the sky. It echoes in every act of selfless courage, and it echoes in the heart of every person who has ever stood firm to protect their home and their family from the darkness. The legacy of Thor is the legacy of strength in the service of protection. The legacy of thunder is forever.